When winter settles deep into the bone, what sound does it make? It is the subtle crackle of ice crystals growing beneath the eaves, the distant groan of frozen earth splitting open in the deep of night, the winds howl through the taiga like a dull blade scraping against bone. When your life depends on keeping a single flame alive through months of darkness, what rhythm does survival follow? It is a cadence more primal than a heartbeat, more focused than breath. The interval between each added stick of wood, the force of each puff on the tinder, each adding or subtracting weight on the scales of life and death. You wake in absolute darkness, a darkness so thick it feels like a physical weight upon your closed eyelids. The air inside is still and frigid. Each breath becomes visible white mist, slowly dissipating into the blackness above. Your body aches from a curled sleeping posture. You lie on your side on a bed of dried grass, covered by a rough wool blanket that smells of wood smoke and unwashed human. The cold has crept in during the night as it always does, slipping through the cracks in the log walls, past the layers of bark and moss packed into the fissures, disregarding all your defences, reaching straight for the marrow. You lie still for a moment, listening outside. The wind moves through the taiga, a sound like distant breathing, steady, patient, utterly indifferent to human suffering. Inside, you hear the gentle snore of your sleeping father, the restless shifting of your sister beneath her covers, and beneath it all, the sound you've waited for all night, a faint, almost imperceptible crackle from the hearth. The fire is still alive. Relief washes through you like hot tea, brief and warming, though you have not yet left your bed, but you must act now. One must always act immediately, for a fire alive at dawn can die by noon if untended, and a fire that dies in winter is a death sentence you cannot afford. You push yourself up to sit, and now the cold attacks in full, striking every inch of skin as the blanket slips away. Your breathing becomes quick, shallow. You fumble in the dark for your rough wool coat hanging from a wooden peg in the mud wall. The garment is stiff with cold and old sweat, scraping your skin as you pull it over your linen shirt. Your feet touch the floor. Packed earth, hard as stone, exuding a chill that feels as if it comes from the very centre of the world. You have learned not to stand in one place too long, to keep moving always, for in winter, stillness is a series of small deaths repeated until they coalesce into the real end. The hearth squats in the centre of your dwelling like a patient beast. In the dark you can see only the faintest glow, a single dull orange ember half buried in ash, only slightly brighter than the surrounding blackness. You kneel before it, knees pressing against the cold ground, and stretch out hands already stiff from the chill, though you've just left the bed's slight warmth. The ash feels still warm to the touch, a good sign. With a smooth wooden stick worn by the daily ritual, you gently scrape aside the ash, revealing the ember beneath, a piece of charcoal the size of a child's fist, glowing with stubborn persistence, a near miracle of endurance. You have prepared for this moment. Last night before sleep, you placed 3 strips of birch bark and a small bundle of the finest kindling beside the hearth. Dry pine twigs no thicker than a finger, collected in the fleeting summer and treasured like gold all through autumn. Now you take a strip of bark, tilt it carefully near the ember, wait for the moment when the heat is sufficient. For long seconds nothing happens. Your hands begin to tremble, whether from cold or from fear that the ember might not be strong enough, you cannot tell. Then, with a suddenness that never fails to gratify, a thin wisp of smoke rises from the bark, followed by a tiny flame the size of a petal, but it is alive, dancing, hungry. You feed it gently, adding bark, then the thinnest twigs, building the fire with a patience honed by countless frozen mornings. The flame grows, spreading from one twig to the next, and with each small victory of heat over cold, the darkness inside your dwelling recedes a little. The firelight dances on the low ceiling, just high enough to clear your father's head when he stands, revealing the smoke-blackened logs, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from pegs, the few possessions your family owns arranged along the mud walls. When the flame is the size of your cupped hands, you begin to add larger pieces, wrist-thick branches, then split sections of log. Each piece is considered carefully, for wood is not infinite. For every log you burn today, there is one fewer available tomorrow, the day after that, against the endless white road of wintered days stretching ahead. Your father is up now, coughing softly as he always does, a cold that settled in his chest with the coming of winter. He moves silently to the hearth, and together you build the fire to its daytime strength. It is not a roaring blaze, wood is too precious for that, but a carefully regulated burn, enough to drive the worst of the cold from the dwelling, yet frugal enough to sustain through the morning without exhausting all reserves. As the fire grows, so does the smoke your dwelling, a semi-subterranean asterisk, Zemlyanka asterisk, built of logs and packed earth, has a smoke hole in the roof, but ventilation is poor. Much of the smoke lingers inside, drifting lazily along the ceiling, filling your mouth and nose with its bitter taste. You have lived with this smoke for so long you hardly notice it anymore, though visitors from beyond the taiga, entering such a dwelling for the first time, often cough and weep. The firelight reveals your world more fully. The asterisk, Zemlyanka asterisk, is small, perhaps 4 paces from door to back wall, 5 paces wide, with a ceiling so low your father must stoop to move from one side to the other. The walls are horizontal logs, the gaps chinked with clay mixed with straw and animal dung, then stuffed with moss gathered in damp places on the forest floor in autumn. The floor is simple packed earth, hardened by years of use, sloping slightly toward the central hearth. There are no windows. Windows in winter are an invitation to death, a place for cold to enter with near malicious eagerness. There is only the door, a crude log frame covered with layers of bark and hides, hanging on creaking leather hinges. Even this is not enough. On the coldest days, you hang a blanket behind it, creating a small airlock space to blunt the fiercest winds before they can enter the main room. Your mother and sister are stirring now, and the dwelling fills with the sounds of waking, soft coughs, rustling fabric, the scrape of a wooden spoon against a wooden bowl as someone begins preparing breakfast. It will be simple, a gruel of barley or oats boiled in water. Your father brings each day from a hole chopped in the ice of the nearby stream, with a pinch of salt if you're lucky, and a slice of hard black bread grown stale with age. But there is work before breakfast. There is always work, and in winter nearly all of it revolves around fire and fuel. Your father stands layering himself, wool coat, sheepskin coat with wool inward, rabbit fur hat tied under his chin, covering his ears. He pulls on dogskin mittens and picks up the axe leaning by the door. You dress similarly, though your coat is smaller, many times mended, and each winter you wonder if it will last another year. Together you push open the door, and the waiting cold rushes in like a breached dam. It is a cold that is almost tangible, almost alive, wrapping itself around you, seeking every gap in your clothing, every inch of exposed skin. Your eyes water immediately, tears freezing on your cheeks before they can fall. The world outside is white, grey, and silent snow covers everything. The path to the stream, the woodpile, the other dwellings scattered within the settlement. In places knee-deep, the sky is the colour of dirty wool. The sun, if it has risen, is a pale smear behind clouds, offering light but no warmth, visibility but no comfort. The trees of the taiga loom around the settlement like silent witnesses. Pines, birches, larches, their branches bowed under snow, their trunks black against the white ground. In summer, this forest is full of sounds, birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of wind through leaves. In winter, it is a place of profound quiet, broken only occasionally by the crack of a tree freezing or the distant howl of wolves following the scent of human habitation. You and your father walk toward the woodpile, boots crunching in the snow. Each step is an effort. The snow is deep, the cold makes your legs stiff and awkward. The woodpile is covered with bark slabs weighted down by logs, an attempt to keep the fuel dry, though some snow always sifts beneath. You pull aside the coverings and survey the pile with the calculating, measuring, worrying gaze you have learned to use. The pile is lower than you would like. It is always lower than you would like, because no matter how much wood you gathered in autumn, no matter how carefully you ration through winter, it never seems enough. Every log you remove today makes tomorrow more uncertain. Your father selects a few, not the best, driest pieces, for those must be saved for colder days ahead, but good enough, dry enough to burn without too much smoke. He hands them to you, and you stack them in the crook of your arm, feeling the weight, feeling the wood's cold even through your mittens. 3 pieces, 4. 5. Your arms are full now, and you turn to head back to the dwelling, moving carefully, because to fall in snow this deep could mean wet clothes, and wet clothes in this cold are another kind of death sentence. But your father does not follow. He has the axe now, and is heading toward the forest edge, where fallen wood lies buried beneath the snow. You watch him for a moment, his hunched figure, the way he moves with the careful economy of a man who knows each motion consumes energy, energy that comes from food, and food is scarce in winter. Then you turn, carrying your wood back to the dwelling inside. The fire is strong enough now that the air near the hearth is almost warm. You stack the wood beside it, arranging the pieces so they can dry as much as possible before being fed to the flames. Your mother is heating water now, a pot hanging from a hook over the fire, and the smell of cooking grain begins to fill the dwelling, a thin, almost flavourless scent that makes your stomach clench with hunger. You sit by the fire for a moment, holding your hands out to the heat, feeling the blood return to your fingers with an almost painful tingling. The fire has its beauty, the flickering orange-yellow, the dance of the flames, the play of light on the smoke-blackened walls. You have learned to love the fire with a devotion that goes beyond pure utility. Fire is life. Fire is survival. Fire is the slender thread between existence and the frozen dark outside. Your sister sits beside you, her small hands also reaching for warmth. She's 10, thin and quiet, her face marked by an old burn scar from 2 winters ago when she fell too close to the hearth. Such accidents are common. Everyone in the settlement bears the marks of fire. Missing fingernails, scarred skin, fingers twisted from burns that heal badly. Fire gives life, but fire also takes. You must always respect it, always watch it, always balance between too little heat and too much danger.
Cold, and the endless attention to fire. The days pass in such monotonous rhythm, one blending into the next without clear boundaries. Week, tend fire, gather fuel, eat, tend fire, perform whatever work winter allows, mending tools, patching clothes, twisting rope from scraps of fiber. The light outside never brightens, never lasts. By 3 in the afternoon, the already dim daylight begins to fade by evening. Darkness has returned, complete and absolute. You spend hours searching for fuel. The settlement is surrounded by forest, but not all wood is equal. Fire burns hot but fast, consuming itself in bright flames, leaving you staring at ashes, wondering what was gained. Birch is better, steadier, longer minus lasting, its white bark catching even when damp. Larch is best dense and slow minus burning, but harder to find, harder to cut, from to drag through snow. You learn to read the winter forest. You've learned to identify which trees are dead but still standing, the wood dry, perfect for fuel. You learn where fallen wood collects in gullies and ravines. You learn to judge the age of a fallen tree by its color, its weight, its smell. Old wood is dry but often rotten, crumbling to powder when split. New wood is heavy with moisture, smoking terribly when burned. You are always looking for wood dead long enough to be dry, but not so long that it is rotted. The work of gathering fuel never ends. Every morning you wake, the woodpile is a little lower than the night before. Every night you hope what you gathered during the day will replenish what was burned. The math of winter survival is simple and brutal. If you burn more than you gather, you eventually freeze. If you gather more than you burn, you survive. That gathering enough fuel is a task that consumes every hour of daylight, requiring strength that hunger and cold constantly try to steal. But cold itself is a presence you can never ignore. It is not merely the absence of heat, but something more active, more aggressive. The cold finds way through your clothing no matter how many layers you wear. It numbs your fingers inside your mittens until you can barely hold the axe. When you breathe through your nose, it freezes the moisture in your nostrils, forcing you to breathe through your mouth, and then the frigid air fills your mouth, making your throat ache. Your clothing is never warm enough. The wool, hides, and furs that seemed sufficient in autumn prove inadequate when true winter arrives. The coat cuffs are always damp from contact with snow, and dampness in the fabric means a deeper penetration of cold than if it were dry. Your boots are stuffed with straw for insulation, but within an hour your toes are numb. You learn to heed the warning signs of frostbite, loss of feeling, the waxy appearance of skin, the wooden sensation when you try to move the affected finger. Everyone in the phenomenon, not someone who laughs has to frostbite, someone who lost fingers. Some winters people lose more a foot, a hand, a life. These losses are spoken of in the low, manner minus of minus fact tone used for discussing inevitabilities, but the fear of them lies in everyone who steps out into the cold. Inside the dwelling, life is only marginally more comfortable. The fire keeps the air and ear the hearth tolerable, but the edges of the dwelling remain cold. The walls exude chill. The floor beneath your feet is hard and dicey. Condensation forms on the coldest surfaces and freezes, producing frost inside your home. Sleep is restless, the body curled tight, seeking a warmth that is only slightly out of reach. The smoke is a constant irritant. The dwelling's chimney, if it can be called that, is just a hole in the roof, roughly covered with a lid meant to let smoke escape while trying to keep out rain and snow. The system works brutally. Smoke collects along the ceiling, thick and acrid, and on days when the wind blows from certain directions, it is forced back down into the dwelling, filling the space with choking clouds that make your eyes water and throat burn. You have grown accustomed to the smoke, as people grow accustomed to any constant discomfort. Your clothes always smell of it. Your hair, your skin, everything you own carries the scent of wood smoke. When you close your eyes to sleep, you can still smell it. Sometimes you wonder if you will ever be truly clean again, if there will ever be a moment when every breath you take is free of that scent. Water, even another burden winter imposes. In summer, water is abundant. The stream runs clear and cold, easy to dip a bucket into. In winter, the stream freezes solid, and water must be one. Every morning, your father takes the iron rod, one of the few metal tools your family owns, to the stream. At the spot he has marked, he pounds the rod down through the ice, chipping, breaking, widening the hole that froze overnight. The work takes time and strength, and when he finally breaks through, he must reach into water so cold it feels like knives, quickly fill the bucket, and return before the hole begins to freeze again. The water must be carried carefully back to the dwelling, because water spilled on this journey is wasted water, and wasted water means another trip to the stream, another breaking of ice, another expenditure of precious energy. Inside, the water is placed near the fire to thaw and warm slightly, for drinking ice water in winter is an invitation to illness, and illness in winter is often fatal. You ration water as carefully as you ration wood. Washing is minimal, a wipe of face and hands with a damp cloth every few days. A full body washing happens only when absolutely necessary. The luxury of cleanliness belongs to summer. In winter, you learn to live with your own smell, the smell of others, the accumulated odor of bodies not properly washed for weeks. Your clothing is worn in layers, never fully removed. At night you might shed your coat, but the inner layers stay on, providing insulation as you sleep. In the morning, you add the outer layers again, starting the new day wearing yesterday's sweat, yesterday's grime, yesterday's lingering chill. The fabric stiffens with accumulated dirt and body oils, chafing skin at friction points, wrists, neck, the small of the back, creating raw spots that never truly heal because there is no surplus of heat for healing, no excess nutrition for repairing something as trivial as damaged skin. The food you eat provides just enough energy for the work winter demands. A family stores grain, dried peas, a little salt, perhaps some dried fish or meat if the autumn hunt, where well must last until spring, and spring is months away. He would eat 2 meals a day, sometimes 3 if stores allow, but the portions are never enough to fill you. You can sleep hungry, wake up hungry, hunger becoming the constant companion of cold. Together they steal your strength and warmth. Your hands tell the story of winter survival. They are cracked and rough, the skin split in places from constant cold and handling wood. These splits never heal, because there is no surplus heat for healing, no excess nutrition for repairing something as trivial as damaged skin. You learn to ignore the pain in your hands, as you learn to ignore the many small pains that accumulate into a vast ache that lives in your bones from the first snow to the last thaw. And night brings a different kind of struggle. The fire must be kept alive through the night, or you will wake to a dwelling as cold as the outdoors, with only the desperate hope of finding a live ember to rekindle the flame. That keeping a fire alive all night means waking periodically to add fuel, means interrupted sleep, means a fatigue that accumulates through the winter months. Your family takes turns keeping watch, each person responsible for a certain stretch. When it is your turn, you lie in the dark, listening to the fire, watching the glow, waiting for the moment when the flames have diminished enough that more wood must be added. You rise from your bed, shivering as the warm covers slip away, kneel before the hearth, and feed it carefully, trying not to add too much wood and waste it, trying not to add too little and risk the fire dying. The wind outside is your constant companion. You can hear it moving through the settlement, whistling through gaps in your dwelling, pressing against the walls with a force that sometimes seems determined to tear your shelter apart. On the worst nights, the wind screams through the taga, a sound like a living thing in torment, and the walls of the dwelling groan and creak, and you lie awake wondering if this will be the night the cold finally finds a way in. The settlement itself is a cluster of perhaps 20 dwellings scattered along the edge of a clearing hacked from the forest years ago. In summer, the settlement is almost pleasant. Vegetable gardens grow between homesteads. Children play, cook fires send smoke straight up into a peaceful sky. In winter, the settlement becomes a desperate cluster of survival. Each family turns inward to its own struggle. Contact with neighbors is minimal, because every trip outside means exposure to the cold. Every conversation in the frozen air means lost warmth. But you see neighbors occasionally nonetheless. You see old Mikhail, who lost 3 fingers to frostbite years ago and now wears gloves with the fingertips sewn shut. You see the widow Y. Evdokaya, whose husband died in a logging accident last autumn, who must now tend her own fire, gather her own wood, with only her young daughter to help. You see the 2 archaeology who have 5 children and never enough food. The younger children always having other families' hearths, hoping for that food or melting and extra warmth. There are conflicts, small and petty, inevitable when people are cold, hungry, and afraid. Arguments over wood who took more than their share from the common area of fallen timber, who cut a living tree before the community decided it was necessary. And it's over fire whose smoke all has become too light, creating a draft that steals heat from neighboring dwellings with and burning green wood that produces too much smoke. These arguments are conducted in low voices with a forced civility that barely masks desperation. No one in winter can afford to make an enemy, because you might need the neighbor tomorrow, might need help breaking ice, or hauling an injured family member, or borrowing a cup of grain when your own stores run out. That neither can anyone afford generosity, because your own survival is always uncertain, always dependent on having just enough of everything to last until spring. The children of the settlement grow quiet in winter. In summer, often between dwellings, sighing, playing games. In winter they huddle by the fire, as large and thin faces, movements slow and careful, play reduced to quiet activities sorting stones, twisting straw into shapes, listening to the few stories the adults will tell. Some winter's children either fall through ice, or develop a fever that turns to pneumonia, or simply grow weaker and weaker until one morning they do not wake. These deaths are mourned quietly, without ceremony, because there is no spare energy for elaborate grief. Your own sister sometimes coughs at night, a dry, rasping cough that worries your mother. But there is nothing to be done except hope, except keep her close to the fire, except give her an extra spoonful of porridge when stores allow. Medicine is a distant dream. Doctors are in cities hundreds of miles away, places you have never seen. So you simply wait, hoping her body will fight off whatever illness might try to take root. The repetition of days creates a kind of trance. Quick, firewood, water, food, fire, dark, sleep. Quick, fire, wood, water, food, fire, dark, sleep. Each day the same as the last, each day blurring into the next until you begin to lose your sense of time. 20 days since the first snow. 30? You cannot remember. Time in winter is not measured in days, but in wood consumed, in the slow dwindling of your stores, in the gradual weakening of your own body. Sometimes you stand outside even when there is no work to do, just to feel something different. The cold burns your face. Your breath forms plumes of steam that drift away on the gray air. You look out over the white expanse of the clearing and the dark wall of forest beyond, and feel something that mixes despair with wonder. This is your life. This is the world you were born into. The world you will likely die in this cold. This struggle. This endless negotiation with fire and fuel and frost. There are brief, unexpected moments when something like beauty appears. The morning when the sun breaks through clouds and makes the snow glitter like scattered diamonds. An evening when the northern lights appear, green and purple curtains undulating across the sky as if from another world. A night when the full moon rises bright, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost magical, almost unreal. These moments do not make the struggle easier. They do not warm your hands, fill your belly, add wood to your pile. But they remind you you are alive. You are witnessing something. This world, for all its hardship, its cold, its indifference, is still a world worth seeing. Your father sometimes speaks of the old country, the place her family came from before settling this frontier. He speaks of it as if it were warmer, easier, more comfortable, though you suspect he's remembering a past that was never quite as good as memory has shaped it. The reasons he left that place he does not discuss. For now your home is at the edge of the empire, in a place where winter rules most of the year and survival is the only ambition that matters. There are indigenous people who live in the taiga, who have been here for generations beyond counting. Sometimes you see them families moving through the forest, sleds pulled by reindeer, clothing made of reindeer hide and decorated with intricate beadwork. They seem more adapted to the cold than your people, more at home in this environment. They have winter survival techniques. Your family does not know ways of building shelters, preserving food, traveling over snow that seem almost magically efficient. Your father trades with them occasionally, exchanging a few metal tools for dried meat or warm furs. As once, an even keen aunt showed him how to lay heated stones beneath the floor of a dwelling, creating warmth that would radiate upward for hours after the fire died. Your father tried to implement the technique, but the stones he could find were not the right kind, and they cracked in the heat, and the project was abandoned. Still, the memory remains. There might be better ways to survive, if only you knew them. The fear of the fire going out is so constant it becomes part of your dreams. Each dream you wake to a cold hearth. You frantically sift through ashes, desperately searching for an ember, finding none. The cold rushes in, fills the dwelling, freezes you where you kneel. You wake from these dreams with your heart pounding, immediately checking the fire even if it is not your watch, even if you have hours up before you need to rise. The fire must live. Everything depends on it. As winter deepens, The cold intensifies. Temperatures drop to levels that seem impossible to survive. The air itself feels solid, resistant, as if you were trying to breathe stone. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Cell tools become dangerous, impossible to touch with bare hands. The ice on the stream grows thicker each day, requiring more work to break through. The sun, when it appears, is a pale ghost of itself, barely rising above the horizon before beginning to set again. Daylight lasts only a few hours, and those hours are dim and gray, offering little warmth, little comfort. You live mostly in darkness, or near minus darkness. The only reliable light comes from the fire, and a fire's light is small and confined, pushing back the dark only within the walls of your dwelling. Sometimes you wonder what real warmth could feel like. Not just the absence of the worst cold, but real warmth. Eyeing like clothing, locking without heaviness, sleeping without curling tight, breaking without the immediate need to tend a fire. Summer is a memory so distant it feels like a story you were of rather than something you experienced. You cannot quite believe there will be another summer, cannot quite trust that this cold will end. But it will end. Spring will come eventually, though spring is still months away. The snow will melt. The ice will break. The world will thaw and grow green again. Their family will survive, or it will not. Many families will survive. Some will not. This is the arithmetic of winter on the Siberian frontier, and everyone knows it. Everyone accepts it, because there is no other choice. For now, there is only wood to gather, fire to tend, cold to endure. Only the slow passage of identical days, resources carefully rationed, the hope that what you have is enough. Only the rhythm of survival: wake, tend, gather, eat, tend, sleep, repeated endlessly through the long dark. As evening approaches, you kneel before the hearth again. Add 3 pieces of wood with careful precision. The flames rise around them, orange, yellow, alive, and you watch them for a moment. Feel their warmth on your face. Let yourself believe, just for this moment, that you will make it through another night, another day, another week of winter. The fire crackles softly, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Outside, the wind is picking up, the cold pressing closer. But inside, for now, there is enough warmth to survive, and survival, in the end, is all winter asks of you. Stone memory: the story of Ivan Petrovich. There was a man named Ivan Petrovich, born in the winter of 1782, coming into this world in a dwelling half-minus buried in permafrost on the banks of the Yenisei. He was born during a blizzard that lasted 3 days, his first breath taken of air thick with smoke and the sound of wind tearing at walls. His father was in exile for reasons lost to time, perhaps an unpaid debt, a pay crime, perhaps simply the bad luck of being in the wrong place when officials needed bodies to fill the empty spaces at the empire's eastern edge. His mother was the daughter of another exile, a woman who knew only frontier life, who had never seen a city or walked a paved street. They were not particularly important people. Their names recorded nowhere, their lives unremarkable except for the simple fact that they survived. The settlement itself hardly deserved the name. Some 20 dwellings scattered along a river bend, each partly dug into the earth for insulation, each forever shrouded in the smoke that hung in the still air of a winter morning like the visible manifestation of human presence. Ivan grew up in the way children do in such places, shaped slowly by cold, smoke, and the endless rhythm of gathering fuel. He learned to walk by staggering between hearth and wall. He learned to speak by listening to his parents' quiet voices through long winter nights. His earliest memories were of fire, the way it flickered and danced, the way it felt on his face, the way his father's hands moved as he fed it, thoughtful and careful, as if handling something both sacred and dangerous. The fire was never allowed to go completely out, not even in summer when its heat was stifling, because starting a new fire required precious effort and materials that could not be wasted. By the age of 5, Ivan could tend the fire. He could scrape ash, could judge whether an ember was strong enough to accept kindling, could arrange wood in the pattern his father had taught him, one that allowed airflow but did not waste fuel. These were the fundamental skills of a frontier childhood, more important than letters or numbers, more valuable than any lesson a distant schoolteacher might offer. A child who could not manage a fire by 6 was a burden rather than a help. And burdens on the frontier rarely lived to adulthood. His father taught him the language of wood. Pine speaks fast, his father would say. Burns bright and quick. A friend when you need immediate warmth, but a poor companion for a long night. Birch is steady and reliable, the backbone of winter. Larch is treasure, dense and slow, minus burning. When you find good larch, you treat it with respect, save it for the coldest days. Ed unlearned to read the forest alongside his father. They would walk together through the snow, the boy following the Nan's tracks, learning which trees were dead, which are dying, which had fallen in storms and lay hidden beneath the white blanket. His father taught him to listen for the hollow sound of wood when apped with an axe handle, to smell the difference between the sweetness of rotten and the clean scent of good, seasoned wood, to judge by bark color and the texture of a tree's surface whether the wood inside would burn well or poorly. These walks were not leisure, they were survival training, education in the most literal sense. There were other lessons, taught not through words but through observation. Five unlearned that his father's hands were always damaged, cracked, bleeding in places, nails blackened from impact and cold. He learned that adults moved slowly in winter, conserving energy, that waste was the gravest sin a person could commit. He learned that fire was the center of everything, that a man who could not keep a fire alive would see his family die. When Ivan was 7, a brother was born, and for a brief time there were four in the family. But the baby sickened in its first winter, developing a cough that rattled in its tiny chest. Despite his mother's attempts to keep him warm, despite extra time by the fire, despite whispered prayers to saints whose names were confused with older, half-minus forgotten beliefs, the infant died before its first birthday. They buried him in the snow because the ground was too frozen to dig, marking the spot with stones. In spring, when the snow melted, they would bury him properly. But spring seemed impossibly distant, and when it came, other concerns took priority, and the boy's grave was never properly completed. This death shaped something in Ivan. He began to watch the fire with an intensity that went beyond normal attention. He would sit for long periods staring into the flames, his young face serious, his eyes tracking the movement of heat and smoke. His mother worried he was not quite right, that his brother's death had damaged something in his mind. But his father understood differently. The boy was thinking. The boy was learning things on a level beyond the simple mechanics of survival. Ivan could chop wood with reasonable efficiency. His arms were thin but growing stronger. He learned to let the axe's weight do most of the work, to aim for the natural cracks in the wood, to strike with precision rather than force. He could go into the forest alone and return with fuel, had judged distance and time, could read the sky well enough to know what a storm was approaching. It was time for him to begin returning to the settlement on his own. The winter forest was not a place of peace or beauty. It was a resource to be harvested, a treasure trove of fuel that meant the difference between warmth and death. He also began to pay attention to the indigenous people who occasionally passed through the area. Even key families moved to the taiga with herds of reindeer, seeming to inhabit the cold in a way Russian settlers did not. Eden would watch them from a distance, noting how they layered their clothing, the materials they used, the patterns of their sewing. He watched how they made camp, how they constructed temporary shelters, how they managed fire in the open. His father traded with these people occasionally, exchanging a few metal needles or small knives for dried meat or furs, and Ivan would stand quietly during these exchanges, listening, watching. Once, an even key elder noticed the boy's attention, smiled, a brief expression of understanding, said something in his own language that Ivan did not understand. But the tone was clear. The boy was alert, and alertness was the beginning of wisdom. The even key moved on as they always did, their sleds disappearing into the white vastness, and Ivan stood at the edge of the settlement, thinking about what he had seen. As Ivan entered adolescence, his body taking on the lean, hardened quality from too lethal imposed on everyone who survived, he began to experiment. He tried arranging wood in different patterns on the hearth, testing whether certain configurations burned longer or hotter. He experimented with the smoke hole, partly blocking it to see if he could keep more heat inside while still allowing enough smoke to escape. Some experiments failed. Some filled the dwelling with smoke, drawing his mother's anger, his father's quiet disapproval. But some worked, producing small improvements in warmth or fuel efficiency. When Ivan was 15, his father broke his leg in a logging accident. A tree fell wrong, pinning the older man to the frozen ground, and when they finally freed him, his leg was bent at an angle that turned Ivan's stomach. They splint at it as best they could. The leg healed, but it healed crooked, and afterwards his father walked with a pronounced limp, and the work of gathering fuel fell more heavily on Ivan's shoulders. The older man tried to continue helping, but his movements were slower now. His endurance diminished. He could no longer go as far into the deeper forest where the best fallen would lay. This shift in responsibility changed him. He was no longer an assistant, but the primary provider of fuel that kept his family alive. The weight of this knowledge settled into him, like cold settling into wood, profoundly altering his structure. He became more serious, more focused. He spent longer in the forest, searching for the best fallen timber, ranging farther from the settlement than was strictly safe, driven by the need to gather enough, always enough, never to face a morning with an empty wood pile. Some days he returned so tired he could barely eat before collapsing into sleep. His body understood what his mind could not yet articulate with full clarity. Survival was not a state, but a process, endless and demanding. During this time, Ivan began to notice patterns others seemed not to see. He noticed that certain dwellings in the settlement were warmer than others, and he began to investigate why. He observed the Nikitin family's dwelling, which, though built similarly to his own, somehow retained heat better. He spent time observing, asking questions, until he discovered that old Nikitin had lined the inside of his walls with an extra layer of bark, creating a small air gap that seemed to insulate the interior. Ivan experimented with this in his own dwelling, adding a bark lining to one wall as a test. The improvement was noticeable, but not dramatic. Still, it was something, and something was always better than nothing. He began to wonder what would happen if all the walls were so laid that the work was immense. The bark would have to be collected in summer when it peeled most easily, and summer was already filled with other urgent tasks. He also developed an interest in the stones scattered to the Taga, smooth river stones, angular granite blocks, flat slabs that thrust from hillsides. He remembered the story his father had told him years before about even Key using heated stones to warm dwellings. His father's attempt had failed. The stones had shattered, but Ivan suspected this was because of the type of stone, not the technique itself. Not all stones were equal. He had learned this from watching which stones survived repeated heating in the hearth and which fractured. He began to collect stones, bringing them back to the farm, testing them. He would heat a stone in the fire until it was almost a hat to approach, then carefully remove it and watch what happened. Some stones cracked immediately, splitting with a sharp report, fragments flying dangerously. Some stones held heat briefly but cooled quickly. But some stones, smooth river stones of a certain size and shape, absorbed the heat and radiated it back slowly, remaining warm to the touch for hours. This discovery fascinated him. He began to imagine possibilities, a way to extend the warmth of the fire beyond the immediate circle of the hearth, a way to store heat that could be released slowly through the night, reducing the need to constantly feed the flames. In his mind, he could see heat moving through stone like water through earth, seeping, flowing, lasting. But experimentation took time, and time was a luxury winter never gave easily. Ivan had to balance his curiosity with the practical demands of survival. Wood still needed to be gathered. Water still needed to be hauled. Fire still needed constant attention. His experiments became something he pursued in stolen moments late at night, when others slept, early in the morning before the day's work began. When Ivan was 18, Came a winter the old people would speak of for years afterwards with awed fear. It was the winter of 1800, and it came early and unusually severe. Snow fell in October and did not stop. Temperatures dropped to levels that killed trees, froze the Yenisei's so deep that even in the center of the strongest current, the ice was thick enough to support sledges. The settlement struggled. Wood supplies meant to last until January were exhausted in December. Families began to ration fuel desperately, burning as little as possible, huddling together to share warmth, letting dwellings grow cold between morning and afternoon. People began to die, the youngest and oldest first, as always, but then others. A man in his 30s fell through ice trying to reach us, and of dead trees on an island in the river. A woman fell asleep beside a dying fire and never woke. Ivan's family faced a same crisis as every other. They would pile shrank at an alarming rate. His father, despite his damaged leg, insisted on helping gather fuel, but the exertion left him breathless and weak. His mother grew thin and silent, her face gaunt with worry. Deeper and fetcher at table 2 stools, a wooden chest that had held grain. They burned fence posts, tool handles, anything that would burn. During this terrible winter, Ivan's mind returned to the heated stones. He knew they worked. He had proven it to experiment, but he had never tried to implement the technology on a scale that could make a real difference, never tried to integrate a store of heated stones into the actual fabric of their dwelling. The idea felt both obvious and impossible. Obvious because he had already seen the principle work on a small scale. Impossible because altering the basic structure of a dwelling in indigenous winter seemed madness. He began to plan. At night, lying beside the carefully rationed fire, he sketched ideas in his mind, a pit lined with the right kind of stones beneath the floor of the dwelling, stones heated in the fire during the day, then placed in the pit and covered with earth, the heat radiating up to the floor, warming the dwelling from below. If it worked, it would mean burning less wood at night, longer intervals between feedings, a more stable temperature. The logic was sound, but logic and reality did not always align, especially in winter, and everything was harder. Every action required twice the effort for half the resources. The problem was implementation. Hiking in winter was nearly impossible. The earth was frozen solid, but there was a spot near the back wall of their dwelling where a stone had been partly excavated years before, and the floor was first leveled. The depression was shallow, but it might be enough for a small test. Ivan spoke to his father about the idea. His father listened with the patient expression of a man who had heard many desperate ideas, most of them impractical, but he did not dismiss it. The times were desperate, and desperate times made room for experimentation. If Ivan wanted to try, he could try. His mother said nothing, but her eyes held a mixture of hope and skepticism that Ivan understood perfectly. Hope because any possibility of improvement was worth grasping. Skepticism because life had taught her most plans failed. Ivan began to collect suitable stones, smooth river stones, each first tested in the fire to ensure it would not shatter. He dug the depression deeper, working in short bursts because the work was exhausting, and he still had other duties. He carefully lined the pit, making sure the stones fit snugly, creating a bowl-minus-like structure that could hold heat. The work took days, each session leaving him trembling with exhaustion, his hands so cold they ached even when he was near the fire. The first test came on a night when fuel supplies were particularly low. During the day, Ivan heated stones in the fire until they glowed faintly in the dwelling's dim light. Using wooden tongs his father had made, he carefully moved the stones from the hearth to the pit, packing them close together, then covering them with a layer of sand and earth he had kept near the fire to prevent freezing. The process was slow and dangerous. The stones were heavy enough to crush fingers if dropped, hot enough to cause serious burns if mishandled. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The stones were buried. The earth covered them. The dwelling felt no warmer, and Ivan's mother looked at him, an expression that might have been pity or disappointment, and Ivan felt the weight of failure settle over him. He had spent days on this project, used fuel that could have warmed them directly to heat stones, exhausted himself for what seemed like nothing. But, as the evening wore on, something changed. The floor near the pit began to feel warm underfoot, not hot, but distinctly warmer than the surrounding earth. His mother noticed at first, standing near the spot, then kneeling to place her hand on the ground. Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked at Ivan with something like surprise. His father came over, limping, stood on the warm spot, his weathered face showing the slightest of smiles. Through the night, the warmth persisted. That was not enough to heat the entire dwelling, but it created a zone of relative comfort, a place where the cold did not penetrate as deeply, where you could sit and lie down without feeling the frozen earth anew. For importantly, it meant they could let the hearth fire burn lower at night, without the dwelling becoming intolerably cold. Ivan stayed awake most of that night, not from cold, but from a strange mixture of relief and excitement, his mind already racing ahead, thinking of refinements and improvements. Word of Ivan's experiments spread slowly through the settlement in the cautious way information moves among people to tired, to cold for enthusiastic gossip. At first, the reaction was skeptical. Stones in the ground, finicky work for questionable benefit. Fuel could be burned in the fire just as easily, with immediate results. But skepticism was a luxury. And as winter tightened its grip, luxuries disappeared. But as winter continued and fuel supplies dwindled further, desperation made people willing to try anything. The Nikitin family asked Ivan to show them how to build a similar pit. Then the Barovi family, then others. Ivan found himself moving from dwelling to dwelling, offering advice on pit location, stone selection, covering techniques. He was uncomfortable with this attention. He had always been quiet, more observer than leader, but the need was urgent, and he could not refuse. Some families did not have suitable stones. Some lacked the strength to dig even a shallow pit in frozen ground. That, for those who did implement the technique, the results were consistent, a modest but real extension of the fire's warmth, a reduction in the amount of fuels needed to maintain survivable temperatures. Each successful implementation felt like a small victory against winter, but victories were always temporary, and winter was patient. Ivan became known for this, but known is perhaps too strong. He did not become famous or celebrated, but people remembered him as the one who had shown the stone minus heating method. When they spoke of that terrible winter in later years, his name was sometimes mentioned, usually in passing, usually as part of a longer story, but mentioned. This recognition made him uneasy. He had done what he did out of necessity, and the idea that his family's survival technique might be seen as some kind of gift to others felt strange to him. Ivan himself, the success of the technique awakened something deeper. He had solved a problem. He had observed, experimented, and created a solution that worked. This experience marked him in ways that were both satisfying and unsettling. He began to wonder what other improvements might be possible, what other techniques might lay hidden in the practices of indigenous peoples, or in combinations of methods no one had thought to try. The frontier was full of suffering, but perhaps some of that suffering was not inevitable. Perhaps some of it could be reduced through careful thought and patient work. As that hard winter finally relaxed its grip, as days gradually lengthened, as the worst of the cold began to ease, Ivan's family survived. They survived, thin and exhausted, fuel reserves completely gone, food reduced to the last scrapings from the grain barrel. But they survived. Many families in the settlement survived. Some did not. There was grim work in early spring dealing with those who had frozen, starved, or simply given up. In the years that followed, Ivan continued to refine his heating technique. He experimented with different configurations of stone pits, multiple pits in a single dwelling, ways to direct heat more efficiently. He learned to identify not just good heating stones, but the best heating stones, certain types of granite particularly good at absorbing heat, certain sizes and shapes that stored warmth most effectively. Each refinement was tiny, each improvement marginal, but margins accumulate over years into something significant. He also began to pay closer attention to smoke management. He noticed that certain dwellings, despite similar fires, were less smoky than others. Through careful observation, he realized the angle of the smoke hole mattered. that certain configurations created better airflow, drawing smoke up and out rather than letting it accumulate inside. Smoke was more than a nuisance. It damaged eyes, made breathing difficult, coated everything in a layer of sooty residue that made fabrics brittle. He experimented with his own smoke hole, adjusting its size, building a simple hood around it from scraps of bark and clay. The improvements were incremental, a little less smoke here, slightly better airflow there, but they accumulated into a noticeable difference. His dwelling was never completely free of smoke, but it was less oppressive than many others. His family's eyes watered less, throats burned less, clothing carried slightly less of the smoky smell. These small comforts mattered more than an outsider might understand. They meant less suffering, more energy for other tasks, a slightly higher quality of life in a place where quality was measured in minimal increments. When Ivan entered his 20s, he married Darya, the daughter of a settler family from a neighboring settlement. She was practical and strong, her hands as damaged as his own, her eyes holding the quiet endurance all frontier women possessed. They built their own dwelling, and in its construction, Ivan implemented every technique he had learned. The stone minus heating pit was larger, more carefully built. The smoke hole was precisely angled. The walls were double minus layered, with an air gap for insulation. The dwelling was not luxurious. No dwelling in the settlement could be called luxurious, but it was slightly warmer, slightly less smoky, slightly more efficient in its use of fuel. These small margins meant Ivan and Darya suffered slightly less than their neighbors, had slightly more energy to spare, worried slightly less about whether their fuel would last the winter. Children came, a daughter, then a son, then another daughter. Ivan taught them what his father had taught him, and he also taught them the extra things he had learned to experiment. His children grew up knowing how to choose heating stones, how to judge the angle of a smoke hole, how to layer walls for insulation. These techniques became part of their inheritance, more valuable than any material possession. As Ivan grew older, his back growing stiff, his hands increasingly twisted by what would later be called arthritis, he became someone younger settlers occasionally consulted. How should I build my hut? What stones should I use? Why is my dwelling so smoky? Ivan would offer advice quietly without shout, sometimes helping with construction if his body allowed, sometimes just explaining and leading the work to others. He never asked for payment. If knowledge was not something he sold, it belonged to the settlement, to the collective effort of survival. He never developed a formal system, never wrote his methods down in any organized way. Frontier made little use of written documents, and Ivan himself was barely literate, his education limited to a few seasons with a wandering priest who taught basic letters before moving on. But his knowledge lived on in the dwellings he helped to build, in the stone pits that slowly spread through the settlement, in the children who learned from him and carried his techniques forward. This was how knowledge moved on the frontier, not through books or formal instruction, but through demonstration and practice, absorbed into the body's memory, passed from hand to hand. Heaton's greatest innovation came late in his life. When he was in his 50s, he had been thinking about heat distribution the way the stone pit warmed upward, but did not spread heat horizontally very effectively. He wondered if there was a way to channel the heat so it moved to where it was needed, rather than simply dissipating in all directions. The problem occupied his mind for years, returning in quiet moments, bothering him with the persistence of an unresolved question. He experimented with clay tunnels, narrow tunnels shaped from clay and embedded in the floor, connecting the stone pit to other areas of the dwelling. Floor air from the stones would travel through these channels, emerging from vents he created in different locations. The technique was partly borrowed from something he had heard about rumors of heating systems in the distant architecture of China, though the details were vague, likely distorted through multiple retellings. He could not verify the accuracy of what he had heard, but the principle seemed reasonable enough to investigate. His first attempts failed. The channels collapsed, or they did not cut in properly, or they filled with condensation and froze, blocking the flow. But he persisted, adjusting angles, refining construction, learning through failure. Each failure taught him something: the minimum thickness clay needed to hold structural integrity, the optimal diameter for airflow, the importance of gentle slopes rather than sharp angles. Eventually, he created a system that worked, crudely, imperfectly, but effectively. Gorn air from his stone pit would travel through the clay channels and emerge near the sleeping area of his dwelling, distributing heat more evenly than simple radiation could. Few other families adopted this technique. It was too complex, to time minus consuming to build, to count a failure if not constructed precisely, thought and Niven's own dwelling, and made a noticeable difference. In his later years, he took a quiet pride in the fact that his home was one of the warmest in the settlement, despite his aging body's diminished ability to gather large amounts of fuel. The pride was not boastful. He rarely mentioned his innovations unless asked, but it was real. The satisfaction of having spent a lifetime solving an important problem. Ivan Petrovich died in the winter of 1854, at the age of 17-2, a remarkable age for a frontier settler, testament to some combination of luck, technique, and stubborn resilience. He died in his sleep beside the stone-heated floor he had created decades before, in a dwelling warmer than most, with his children and grandchildren nearby. His passing was quiet, fitting for a quiet man, and when they found him in the morning, his face held a peace those who knew him thought appropriate. He was buried in the settlement's small cemetery, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross that would rot away in a few years. No one wrote his biography. No official record noted his contributions. He was one among tens of thousands of settlers, one of countless lives lived and ended in the difficult spaces at the empire's eastern edge. But his techniques endured. Stone-heating pits continued to be built in the settlement and, through demonstration and word of mouth, in neighboring settlements, families continued to use his methods for smoke management, insulation, heat distribution. His knowledge was absorbed into the community's collective practice, losing its association with his name, becoming simply the way things were done. This was Ivan's legacy, not fame or recognition, but the quiet continuation of techniques that made winter survival slightly less brutal. His life was spent in close attention to fire, stone, and smoke, in patient observation and incremental improvement. He did not change his world, but he made it slightly more bearable, in a place where survival was never guaranteed. Slightly mattered. The settlement on the Yenisei continued. Inhabitants continued to struggle with cold and hunger, but they struggled with the techniques Ivan had helped develop, in dwellings that had absorbed his innovations, with the knowledge he had helped spread. Years after his death, an old woman in the settlement, one who had known Ivan as a child, was asked by her granddaughter why they used the stone-heating under the floor. The old woman paused, thought, and said simply, "Ivan did it that way." The granddaughter did not know who Ivan was, did not think to ask. The technique had outlasted the memory of its originator, which is perhaps the most enduring kind of legacy, the kind so thoroughly absorbed into practice that its beginnings are forgotten. Ivan Petrovich was a man who understood that winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be navigated. He understood that frontier survival required not heroism, but attention, not dramatic gestures, but steady, patient effort, repeated over decades. He understood that the difference between freezing and staying warm was often a matter of small innovations carefully applied, of stones arranged just so, of the smoke hole angled precisely, of knowledge accumulated slowly and shared quietly. These were not insights from philosophy or formal education, the practical wisdom born of necessity and refined through experience. In the endless white winters of the Siberian taiga, Ivan's life was a small flame, not brilliant, not widely visible, but warm, steady, enduring through years of darkness, in a place where warmth was life itself. This was no small achievement. The story, like the stories of so many who lived on the empire's frontiers, was unrecorded in official histories. There are no monuments built to commemorate him, no plaques honoring his innovations, no scholarly papers analyzing his methods. In fact, in the dwellings along the Yenisei, in the stone pits that continue to warm families through brutal winters, in the smoke holes that draw properly, in the insulated walls that hold heat, and all these things, Ivan Petrovich still lives. His careful thought and patient experiment continued to serve lives. He would never know continued to push back the cold that always waits, always ready to reclaim the warmth humans managed to create. IV. Archaeology of residual warmth, the historical echoes of Siberian heating techniques. There are places in the taiga where the snow melts in strange patterns, circular patches that thawed days before the surrounding ground, darker rectangles of earth emerging from beneath the winter's white blanket like shadows rising from below. These anomalies mark the sites of ancient settlements, dwellings long abandoned, wooden structures rotted away to nothing, but stone foundations still retaining a faint memory of warmth. Stone remembers things the surface forgets, retaining some quality thermal mass, mineral composition, simple density that sets it apart from the surrounding soil. Archaeologists who venture into these remote areas, few in number, limited in resources, drawn by curiosity rather than fame, find puzzles in the permafrosts, arrangements of stones that seem too deliberate to be natural, too complex to be mere practical fire pits, layers suggesting purposes beyond simple cooking or warmth, patterns hinting at meanings lost to time. Each excavation reveals more questions than answers, more fragments of technology than complete systems. In one excavation near the Angara River in the early 20th century, researchers found a dwelling floor with 3 distinct stone configurations. The first was clearly a hearth, blackened by soot, cracked by heat, located centrally where a fire would logically burn. The second was a pit filled with smooth river stones, arranged in concentric circles, each layer smaller than the one below, creating a bowl-like depression. The stones showed signs of repeated heating, their surfaces altered by thermal stress, must have been used for years or decades. The third configuration was stranger. Flat stones set in a spoke-like pattern, their surfaces carved with channels. The channels led nowhere, seemed to have no obvious function. The carving was precise, deliberate, indicating someone had invested considerable labor for a purpose opaque to modern observers. The archaeologists carefully documented these finds, photographed, measured, drawn in field notebooks. They wrote papers proposing theories the circular pit might have been for heat storage, similar to techniques known in other cold regions. The radial stones might have been an attempt at heat distribution, though the mechanism was unclear. Perhaps the channels guided water that froze and thawed in a cycle, expanding and contracting to move heat through the stone. Or perhaps they served a completely different function the researchers could not imagine. The carved channels remained unexplained, simply classified in the archaeological report as a feature of unknown function. This phrase recurs in Siberian archaeological reports, an admission of interpreted limits, a placeholder from knowledge irrecoverably lost. But documentation and theory are not the same as understanding. Archaeologists can measure and categorize, but they cannot fully comprehend what it meant to live in such a dwelling, to depend on such a system, to develop such techniques through generations of frozen necessity. The stones are silent, keeping their secrets beneath layers of stratum and time. They have witnessed centuries of winters, but offer no testimony modern science can decode. At another site farther east near the Lena River, excavators found something even more mysterious than what was clearly a dwelling floor. They discovered a chamber race piece about 3 feet deep, 6 feet across, completely lined with flat stones carefully shaped and fitted together. The chamber contained no artifacts, no tools, no bones or charcoal. It was simply an empty space deliberately created and then deliberately filled with earth, sealed. The chamber's purpose sparked debate among scholars. Root cellars seemed unlikely to deep, to finely constructed, and the region's permafrost would make such storage unnecessary. The burial chamber was possible, though the absence of any human remains contradicted this. Ritual space was suggested, but for what rituals, conducted by whom, remained pure speculation. An older researcher who had spent decades studying Siberian indigenous cultures suggested quietly that perhaps the chamber was for heat storage, an extreme version of the stone-heating pit, built on a scale suggesting either great innovation or great desperation. But his colleagues were skeptical. The labor required to build such a chamber would have been immense, and the benefit unclear. Why thought so elaborately when simpler methods could achieve similar results? The debate was never resolved. The site was recorded, the chamber carefully excavated and photographed. Then the earth was backfilled, a location marked on maps few would ever consult. The puzzle remained, buried once more beneath Taga soil, perhaps in another century with different technologies or different theoretical frameworks. Someone will return and find answers these early researchers missed. These archaeological puzzles connect to broader questions about how knowledge moved across the vast Siberian landscape. The region's indigenous peoples, even key, Yakutas, Buryatas, Tangas, and dozens of smaller groups had occupied the Taaframa area before Russian founding began. They developed sophisticated techniques for surviving in one of the world's most punishing climates. Techniques that involved not only practical skills but deep understanding of materials, thermodynamics, and the rhythms of the natural world. This knowledge was not encoded in written texts, but in practice, in the architecture of dwelling structures, in the selection and arrangement of materials, in patterns repeated so consistently they became tradition. The even key, for instance, used structures called chums, conical dwellings covered in reindeer hides, with a central fire and a smoke hole at the apex. The concept was simple, but construction involved complex knowledge, how to angle the poles for maximum stability and interior space, how to layer the hides to allow some ventilation while preventing heat loss, how to position the fire so smoke drew upward effectively, how to dig the floor slightly below ground level to reduce wind infiltration. Every element was critical. Remove or alter any component, and the whole system could fail, filling with smoke or losing heat too quickly. And knowledge needed to build a functional chum was not something one could learn from a single conversation or from observation alone. It required years of apprenticeship, repeated practice, adjustments to local conditions. Yakutas built Balagan-S log structures with thick earthen roofs, entered through a loader that required stooping, designed to trap warm air and minimize heat loss. Some Balagan-S had elaborate stove systems, clay structures that captured the heat of burning wood and released it slowly through thick walls, maintaining relatively stable temperatures even as external conditions swung wildly. These stoves were sophisticated architectural achievements, requiring an understanding of thermal mass airflow and combustion efficiency that would not be out of place in modern engineering discussions. Through experiment, the Yaku test discovered what contemporary physics can explain through theory, that large structures, heated slowly, also cool slowly, that channels within clay or stone can distribute heat more evenly than an open flame, that proper design can make limited fuel resources last a long time. The barrier test developed yurts with felt insulation and carefully designed ventilation systems, structures that could be heated efficiently with minimal fuel and dismantled and moved when necessary. They also practiced a form of hot stone therapy, heating stones in fire and then using them for warmth and medicinal purposes, placing wrapped hot stones on the body to treat cold and linus-related ailments. This practice suggests an understanding of heat, not just as environmental comfort, but as a therapeutic agent, something that could penetrate the body and restore balance. Whether this understanding was medically correct matters less than recognizing it represented the application of systematically observed, generationally developed principles. Russian settlers who arrived in these regions encountered these techniques, observed them, sometimes adopted them, sometimes dismissed them, sometimes adapted them in ways that transformed the original methods beyond recognition. Knowledge exchange was neither simple nor unidirectional. Indigenous peoples also observed Russian techniques, sometimes incorporating metal tools or construction elements into their own practices. Iron hinges, nails, and blades changed construction possibilities. Brick making techniques introduced new materials with different thermal properties. Orthodox architectural forms suggested different spatial arrangements. This cultural interchange created hybrid methods, heating systems combining Russian stove construction with indigenous stone heating techniques, smoke holes positioned according to indigenous understandings of airflow but built using Russian clay working methods. These hybrid systems are difficult for modern researchers to categorize. They fit neither purely indigenous traditions nor purely imported Russian practice, but exist in that intermediate space where cultures mingle through the pressure of practical necessity. The resulting technologies weren't either purely indigenous nor purely Russian, but something emergent, new, created from a collision of different knowledge systems under the pressure of survival in a merciless environment. Not all knowledge spread successfully. Some techniques remained isolated, known to particular groups or even particular families, never spreading beyond immediate neighbors. When those groups dispersed or died out due to disease, displacement, or the simple attrition of frontier life, their knowledge died with them. The archaeological record preserves the physical remnants of these lost techniques, the stones and structures they left behind, but the understanding that gave those structures meaning is gone. There are stories passed down through oral tradition, hinting at more elaborate systems than archaeology has yet discovered. Even key elders speak of stone walls runes built deep in the earth, lined with special stones that could hold heat for days, keeping a space warm enough to survive even when no fuel could be found. These runes were said to have been built by ancestors in times of extreme hardship, designed as last refuges. Descriptions suggest structures more complex than any archaeologically documented subterranean spaces insulated by earth, lined with stones selected for their thermal properties, perhaps even incorporating water that frozen thawed in cycles to regulate temperature. Whether such rooms ever truly existed is uncertain. No definitive archaeological evidence has been found, though absence proves little in a region where excavation is difficult and most potential sites remain unexplored. The stories persist regardless, carrying a sense of ancient ingenuity, of knowledge that might have been real or might have been only wished minus for techniques ancestors either achieved or only dreamed of achieving. In the absence of definitive proof, the stories occupy a liminal space between history and legend, neither confirmed nor disproven, existing as haunting possibilities. Similar stories exist among the descendants of Russian settlers, tales of dwellings that stayed warm without fire, of old Ivan or Fyodor or Mikhail. The name changes with the telling, who discovered some secret method, lost when he died before fully teaching others. These stories have a legendary quality, impossible to verify, likely embellished through repeated telling, but still suggestive of a world where heating was not just a practical necessity, but a field of experiment, even mystery. They hint that within the broader patterns of technology and tradition, there were individual innovations, variants or refinements discovered to be unusually effective, but that knowledge failed to spread before circumstance intervened. Fire itself held complex significance in these cultures. For Orthodox Russian settlers, fire was God's gift, a substance that separated humans from animals, made civilization and survival possible. There were prayers associated with lighting the first fire of winter, rituals to bless the hearth, beliefs that fire carried prayers to heaven through its smoke. The hearth was the spiritual center of the household, blessed and maintained with a care that went beyond practical necessity. But beneath this Christian overlay existed older beliefs, traceable to pre-Orthodox times, to pre-Christian Slavic traditions, only partially suppressed or transformed by centuries of Christianity. These older beliefs held fire to be alive, to have a spirit that could be pleased or offended. It must be respected and never insulted. You did not spit into fire. You did not curse near it. You did not let it die through neglect. To do so was to invite misfortune, illness, the cold death that prowled the winter landscape. Indigenous beliefs were similarly complex. Even Key believed fire was one of the fundamental spirits of the world, related to the sun, to lightning, to life itself. Fire required offering small bits of food tossed into the flames, words of respect spoken before lighting a new fire. The smoke of fire carried messages to the spirit world, and the patterns of smoke could be read by those with knowledge, revealing information about weather, community health, coming events. The Yakutas saw fire as a mediator between the light upper world and the dark lower world. Properly maintaining fire was necessary not only for physical warmth but for spiritual balance. They had complex rules about who could tend certain fires, about which woods were suitable for different purposes, about how to properly extinguish a fire versus letting it die naturally. When Russian and indigenous beliefs intersected, they created syncretic practices half-minus Christian, half-minus shamanistic, not entirely either, but containing elements of both. Settlers might cross themselves before lighting a fire, but also quietly toss a small bit of bread into the flames as an offering, just in case the old spirits were listening. Indigenous people might adopt orthodox prayers but continue to read smoke patterns and observe fire taboos that had nothing to do with Christian theology. The resulting practices made pragmatic sense under conditions of uncertainty. Appealing to multiple sources of spiritual power seemed prudent rather than contradictory. These hybrid practices made sense to the people who performed them. In a world where survival was uncertain, where the forces controlling cold and heat seemed beyond human control, appealing to any power that might help was reasonable. The Christian God, ancestral spirits, fire itself, all were invoked, all were respected, all were given their due. This diversity was experienced not as confusion, but as thoroughness, as covering all possibilities in the face of forces that could kill at whim. Archaeological evidence of these beliefs is subtle, easily missed. Small caches of burned offerings buried near hearths might be interpreted as simple trash disposal, unless the excavator knows to look for patterns, consistent presence of specific materials, careful placement, context suggesting intent rather than accident. Many such caches have likely been excavated and discarded as unimportant, their significance unrecognized. The physical traces of belief are often indistinguishable from the traces of mundane activity, unless the observer knows what questions to ask. Then there are dreams. Multiple accounts from both settlers and indigenous peoples described vivid, intense dreams experienced while sleeping near a dying fire in winter. These dreams are described as unusually clear, unusually memorable, sometimes prophetic or revelatory. They have recurring themes: journeys through frozen landscapes, conversations with deceased relatives, visions of summer warmth, encounters with animal spirits. Modern researchers might attribute such dreams to exposure to carbon monoxide from poorly ventilated fires, to altered states of consciousness brought on by cold and near starvation, to psychological effects of isolation and monotony. These explanations may be correct, but they do not capture what such dreams meant to those who experienced them. For frontier settlers and indigenous peoples, these fire-dreams were significant experiences, events that shaped understanding and sometimes influenced important decisions. Each dream might be interpreted as guidance from ancestors, warning from spirits, prophecy of coming weather or fortune, and acted upon accordingly. Some individuals claimed that certain stones, heated properly and placed in specific configurations, produced particularly clear or powerful dreams. Whether this was true, or whether the belief itself created psychological conditions that made dreams memorable, cannot be known. The stones are silent on the matter, but the persistence of such claims across different groups and time periods suggests that sleeping near stone-heated spaces felt different to those who did it. There's one rarely visited site, in mountains west of Lake Baikal, where Soviet Monastery archaeologists found something they could not explain: a series of stone circles, each about 8 feet in diameter, arranged in a larger pattern suggesting deliberate design. Each circle was lined with stones cracked by heat, evidence of intense and repeated heating. But the stone circles were too far from any settlement, too high in the mountains, in a location offering no obvious advantage for habitation. The archaeologists documented the fight and proposed various theories, perhaps a seasonal gathering place, though the purpose remained unclear. Perhaps a site for specialized activity. Metalworking was suggested, though no evidence of metalworking was found. Perhaps ceremonial, though the culture that created it and the rituals performed there were unknown. The one researcher noted that the stone circles aligned with certain astronomical features: the sunrise at winter solstice, the positions of particular stars. The alignment might have been deliberate, might have been coincidental. The researcher published a cautious paper outlining possibilities without making definitive claims, and the site was added to the long list of Siberian puzzles that may never be fully understood. The mountain's site remains undisturbed, visited occasionally by researchers who measure and photograph but extract no new clarity. In museums in Yakutsk and Krasnoyarsk, there are artifacts recovered from old settlement sites, iron tools, pottery shards, carved bone fragments. Among these objects are items whose purpose remains unclear: flat stones with precisely spaced holes drilled through them, clay tablets imprinted with patterns of lines and dots, wooden tools with curved surfaces seemingly designed for some specific, now minus forgotten task. Curators label these items domestic objects, purpose unknown or possible ritual objects. They sit in storage drawers or display cases, divorced from the context that would give them meaning. Perhaps some of these objects related to heating practices, tools for arranging stones, templates for building smoke holes, devices for measuring temperature or testing wood. Or perhaps they served purposes completely unrelated to fire and heat. Their function was lost when the last person who knew how to use them died without passing the knowledge forward. Written records from the period are scarce and often unreliable. Prussian administrators in Siberian outposts sometimes submitted reports on the territories under their jurisdiction, but these reports focused on taxation, population counts, political stability. Details of daily life, how people heated their homes or managed fire, were considered too trivial to record. When such details do appear in records, they are usually mentioned in passing, in contexts that make them difficult to interpret. An 1807 report mentions that settlers in a particular area were using heathen stones for heating, and that Orthodox priests were concerned this practice indicated insufficient Christian devotion. Yet, the report does not explain what the method involved, why it was considered heathen, or what the priests wanted to do about it. The detail is tantalizing but ultimately insufficient. It confirms something unique was happening. Indigenous techniques were being adopted by settlers, and religious authorities noticed and objected. But the actual practice remains obscure. Another document from 1823 describes a conflict between settlers and indigenous people over access to a particular hillside where good heating stones could be found. The document indicates the dispute was resolved through some sort of agreement, but again, details are missing. What made these particular stones suitable for heating? Why were they scarce enough to fight over? The document does not say. Perhaps the stones had specific thermal properties: high heat capacity, resistance to cracking when heated, ability to retain warmth for long periods, making them superior to alternatives. Personal writings, letters, diaries, memoirs are even rarer. Most frontier settlers were illiterate or barely literate, and those who could write had little time or resources for documentation. The few surviving personal accounts focus on dramatic events, dangerous journeys, violent conflicts, natural disasters. The mundane details of daily survival, including heating practices, are rarely mentioned, presumably because they were so routine as to seem not worth recording. One exception, fragments of a diary recovered from an abandoned settlement dating from the 1840s. The author's name is illegible, and he describes experimenting with different configurations of stones under the floor, trying to achieve better heat distribution. The entries are brief and technical, noting which arrangements worked better or worse, occasionally mentioning failure or small success. Then the diary simply ends. The final entry is a mid-minus sentence. The remaining pages blank or lost. What happened to the author is unknown. The fragment survives as a glimpse into the mind of someone engaged in patient experimentation, someone thinking systematically about problems of heat and survival. But the person remains anonymous, their story incomplete. Modern attempts to recreate historical heating methods have met with mixed success. Researchers build replicate dwellings and attempt to heat them using period minus appropriate techniques, finding the methods more complex than written descriptions suggest. Getting a stone minus heating pit to work properly requires specific knowledge: the right stones, the right depth, the right covering technique, the right timing. Handing a smoke hole to draw effectively requires understanding subtle principles of airflow and pressure that settlers would have learned through trial and error, but are difficult to recapture from archaeological evidence. Some recreations succeed, producing warmth and proving the techniques were indeed viable. Others fail, filling with smoke or losing heat too quickly, or consuming unreasonable amounts of fuel. These failures suggest that successful heating historical settlements required not only physical structures, but also accumulated practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from years of experience, from observational learning, from adjustments and refinements never written down. The gap between understanding a technique in principle and executing it successfully in practice can be vast. One particular puzzle has troubled researchers for decades. At several settlement sites scattered across eastern Siberia, archaeologists have found what appear to be standardized measurement stones with lines carved at regular intervals, sticks notched at consistent distances. These measuring tools seem to have been used in construction, perhaps to ensure smoke holes were built to a specific size or stone pits dug to a specific depth. Standardization suggests an attempt to replicate successful designs, to preserve knowledge about what worked by encoding it in physical standards. The interesting aspect is that the measurements seem consistent between sites separated by hundreds of miles, sites with little contact with each other. This consistency suggests knowledge about optimal dimensions for heating structures spread across vast distances through some communication network that left no other trace. Or perhaps the consistency is coincidental, the result of different people independently discovering the same optimal proportions through experiment. The question remains open. There are botanical puzzles as well. The analysis of charcoal from ancient hearths shows settlers burned a wider variety of wood than expected, including species difficult to work with or that produced problematic smoke. Some of these traces make sense in context in desperate kinds. Any fuel is better than none. That other patterns are harder to explain. Certain woods appear preferentially in particular seasons, woods mixed in proportions that seem deliberate rather than random. One theory is that different woods were believed to have properties beyond their heating value. Perhaps certain woods were thought to ward off illness, but produce less harmful smoke or create specific kinds of dreams. Indigenous traditions in the region do include beliefs about the spiritual properties of different tree species, and it is plausible settlers adopted some of these beliefs or developed their own parallel ones. Larch might have been favored for its association with longevity, birch for purification, pine for its resistance to rotten decay. But proving such beliefs existed is difficult. Charcoal analysis shows what was burned, not why. Patterns might reflect practical considerations modern researchers do not understand, might reflect beliefs never explicitly articulated, or might be purely random variation misinterpreted as meaningful pattern. In the absence of written records or surviving oral testimony, wood selection remains another tantalizing puzzle. In folk traditions that survived into the 20th century collected by ethnographers before they might be completely lost, there are references to fire songs sung by settlers when building a hearth or lighting the first fire of winter. These songs were supposed to ensure the fire would burn well, smoke would drop properly, warmth would last through the cold months. Most of these songs have been forgotten, but fragments were recorded. They represent another form of knowledge transmission, not technical instruction, but ritualized performance encoding correct practice. One fragment, collected in the 1920 seconds from an old woman whose family had lived on the frontier for generations, goes like this: stone below, fire above, smoke between, carries summer's warmth through winter's long night. The words are simple, almost childish, but they encode practical knowledge: the importance of stone heat storage, the management of flame and smoke, the connection between proper construction and enduring warmth. Whether such songs actually contributed to heating is of course debatable, but they served a purpose regardless. They transformed the technical work of building and maintaining fire into something ritualistic, connecting the individual to tradition and community. To sing was to follow the method. To follow the method was to do what had worked for previous generations. The song was a combination of mnemonic device, quality control mechanism, and source of psychological comfort. The archaeological and ethnographic record fragmentary, though it suggests a world where heating was far more than a simple technical problem, was a field of accumulated knowledge, cultural interchange, spiritual belief, and constant experimentation. The methods used were practical, but they were also meaningful, effective, but also mystical, successful, but also not fully understood even by those who used them. Each generation inherited techniques from the previous and modified them through their own experience, creating a slow evolution of practice, responding to changing conditions and available resources. In the museums and storage facilities holding artifacts from these periods, there is a sense of presence. Objects that once served critical purposes, handled daily by people whose lives depended on them, objects filled with current attention and perhaps hope. The stone cracked by heat may look like nothing more than geological material deadened by fire, but it was once part of the system that kept someone alive through winter, that warned someone sleeping child, that made survival possible for one more night. The puzzles persist because full understanding requires not just physical evidence, but lived experience. It would require inhabiting a world where fire was not a convenience, but an essential, where the difference between adequate and inadequate heating could determine survival, where knowledge about stones and smoke and fuel was as important as any other knowledge in life. We can measure and analyze, can propose theories and reconstruct techniques, can gather fragments of information and arrange them into narrative. That at the heart of these heating practices, there is something inaccessible, the knowledge of feeling, the embodied understanding, the sensation of waiting before dawn to scrape ash in search of an ember, the relief when the ember proves strong enough, the satisfaction of warmth won through patient effort. Perhaps this inaccessibility is appropriate. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to be experienced, not just intellectually understood. The stones beneath the permafrost keep their secrets quietly, awaiting questions that may never be fully answered. Witnessing lives lived in close attention to fire and cold. Witnessing communities surviving through ingenuity and endurance. Witnessing centuries of winter nights, when warmth was all that mattered and warmth was never certain. They are monuments to anonymous competence, to the millions of tiny decisions and adjustments collectively making human life possible in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The saga continues. It cycles. Snow falls and melts. Forests grow, burn, and regenerate. In places where settlements once stood, the snow still melts in strange patterns, marking where stones once held heat. These marks fade with time as stones scatter and sink deeper into earth, but they do not disappear completely. They remain as traces, as echoes, as quiet reminders people once lived here, struggled here, found ways to survive here through the dark, the cold, the endless white of winter. Perhaps that is enough. Not full understanding but memory, not complete knowledge, but appreciation for what was achieved with so little, for heating methods that kept the flicker of life alive in frozen places, for puzzles solved and puzzles preserved, for all those winter nights when someone, somewhere in the taiga, managed to keep a fire burning until dawn. The Society of Warmth, thermal stratification in Siberian towns. 300 Zorest es west of Ivan Petrovich's settlement, in the provincial town of Tomsk, a merchant named Gregory Sakharov wakes on a winter morning to a room that is almost warm. It is not the desperate, barely minus the warmth of a frontier's Enlia Nka, but a gentle, sustained warmth from a properly maintained, packed the Russian brick stove that occupies a corner of his bedroom like a benevolent presence. The pack is a marvel of ceramic engineering, nearly 8 feet tall, its surface covered in green-glazed tiles that reflect the morning light filtering through frost-rimmed windows. Inside this structure, a complex system of chambers and channels captures the heat of burning wood and distributes it slowly, evenly through the stove's thick walls. The fire lit in the morning will cause the pack to radiate warmth for 12 hours or more, the stove's surface never becoming dangerously hot, just warm enough to lean against comfortably, to dry clothes upon, to heat water in a can. Sakharov rises from his beta-reel bed with a wooden frame, a mattress stuffed with woolen feathers, and walks barefoot across a floor that is merely cool, not easy. His wife still sleeps, buried under coverlets that are themselves luxuries, cotton fabric, stuffed with goose down, sewn by workshop artisans, not by exhausted family members in a smoky dwelling. In the next room he can hear the children stirring, their voices carrying through the house, muffled by the smoke and low ceilings that impose a muffled quality on frontier homes. A servant is already up. The servant is always up first, her schedule determined by the household's needs, not the sun. She lit the main peck hours before dawn, swept the floors, began preparing breakfast in the kitchen where a second, larger stove provides heat and cooking surface. By the time Sakharov comes down to the dining room, tea is ready, prepared in a samovar, another marker of comfort and status, a brass vessel that keeps water hot all morning, allowing tea to be taken leisurely, not in haste. This is not the frontier. This is not survival measured in armlets of wood and the fear of dying embers. This is comfort purchased with wealth accumulated through trade furs from the interior, grain from agricultural regions, tea and silks, and manufactured goods moving along the routes connecting Siberia to European Russia and beyond, to China and the wider world. The difference between Sakharov's warmth and Divan's warmth is not just a difference of degree, but of kind. Ivan's warmth is active, constantly won, constantly maintained, always precarious. Sakharov's warmth is passive, built into the structures of his life, maintained by others, so reliable it is almost invisible. Ivan thinks about fire constantly because fire is never certain. Sakharov rarely thinks about fire because it is always there, managed by servants, fueled by what he purchases rather than gathers, burning in stones designed by artisans who understand principles of thermodynamics. Ivan could only intuit through trial and error. The peck itself represents generations of refinement. The basic concept, a brick stove with internal channels to capture and distribute heat, had existed in various forms in Northern Europe and Russia for centuries. But the design was constantly improved, adapted, optimized. Internal channels were carefully sized to create proper airflow while maximizing heat extraction. The tiles were not merely decorative but functional, providing thermal mass that absorbed and gradually released heat. A stove's position in the house was calculated to provide warmth to multiple rooms through shared walls. Wealthy families employed stove-builders specialists who understood the complex relationship between fuel, airflow, and heat transfer. These craftsmen commanded high wages, were in constant demand, traveled from town to town building and repairing stoves according to perfected principles. They used standard dimensions, proven designs, materials selected for their thermal properties. The result was heating that worked reliably season after season, requiring minimal adjustment. Sakharov's house has multiple pecca, one in the main living area, one in the main bedroom, a smaller one in the children's room. There is a separate kitchen stove designed primarily for cooking, but also contributing to the house's overall warmth. In the coldest part of winter, all these stoves would burn, their combined heat keeping interior temperatures comfortable even when outside temperatures dropped to levels that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. Fuel for these stoves came from professional woodcutters, men who worked the forests around Tomsk, felling trees, processing them into uniform logs, transporting them to town by sledge in winter or by barge in summer. Safarov purchased wood by the cord, paying prices unimaginable to a frontier settler. But to him, the expense was just one line item in the household budget, no more remarkable than the cost of food or clothing. Wood was stored in a shed behind his house, stacked neatly under a roof that kept it dry. The servant brought wood into the house as needed, maintaining a supply beside each stove so the flames could be fed without interruption. The wood was of good quality, properly seasoned birch and pine, split to uniform size, free of rot or excessive moisture. It burned cleanly, producing minimal smoke. The pecca were designed to efficiently channel what smoke was produced up chimneys that rose high above the roofline, venting into the open air rather than accumulating inside. His careful management of smoke was another marker of privilege. Frontier dwellings were chronically smoky because proper chimney construction required resources and expertise rarely available. But in towns where builders could use brick and mortar, where chimney design was a developed craft, smoke could be almost entirely eliminated. Sakharov's house smelled of tea, cooking food, the faint pleasant scent of burning wood, but not the acrid, burning smoke that permeated every frontier dwelling. The windows in Sakharov's house were another luxury. Glass was expensive, especially in Siberia, but his house had real glass windows, small panes set in wooden frames, allowing light to enter while keeping cold air out. The blast was imperfect, full of bubbles and distortions, but it was infinitely superior to the alternatives used by frontier settlers: oiled cloth that admitted dim light but no clarity, wooden shutters that kept cold out but plunged the interior into darkness, or worst of all, simply gaps in the walls that had to be stuffed with fabric and moss. In the deepest winter, ice would form on the inner surfaces of these windows, frost creating intricate patterns the children found endlessly fascinating. But the ice was a minor inconvenience, not a failure of insulation. The pack provided enough heat that the main rooms remained comfortable despite the cold radiation from the windows. Sakarov's children grew up taking warmth for granted. They played indoors through the whole winter, their games noisy and energetic because they had space and warmth to be active. They did not huddle by the fire, sleep in all their clothes, wake to rooms where breath froze in the air. Winter to them was a season of sleigh rides and snowball fights, of coming inside to hot tea and warm rooms, not of survival and fear. Education was possible in such an environment. Sakarov employed a tutor who came to the house several times a week to teach his children to read, write, and calculate, skills requiring light, warmth, and time, all things frontier children rarely had in sufficient quantities. The children did their lessons at a table in the main room, near but not too near the pack. The temperature was comfortable enough that fingers did not go numb, the light from the windows sufficient for reading, the smoke minus free air allowing concentration without constant irritation. But even within the merchant class, there were gradations of comfort. Sakharov was prosperous, but not as wealthy as the greatest merchants, not as comfortable as government officials might be. His house was comfortable but modest compared to the mansions occupied by the true elite. In Irkutsk, the administrative capital of eastern Siberia, the governor's residence was a palace by Siberian standards. Built of brick and timber, it sprawled across an entire city block, with dozens of rooms arranged around central halls and corridors. The heating system was extraordinary, multiple peki, each a masterpiece of tile and masonry work, fed by staff whose primary job was maintaining fire. The peki in the governor's residence were decorated with imported tiles from European Russia, some from as far away as Holland, depicting pastoral scenes on classical motifs, turning functional heating into artistic display. The governor held balls in winter, officers, administrators, and wealthy merchants gathering in rooms heated to temperatures that allowed women to wear light silk dresses without shawls. Musicians played and people danced, the windows larger and clearer than those in Sakharov's house, revealing the winter night outside, the contrast between interior warmth and exterior cold becoming a kind of theatrical display. Look, the architecture seemed to say, what civilization can achieve. See how thoroughly we have defeated the cold. These balls were half in rooms illuminated by candles, deafened, sometimes hundreds of them. Their combined light and heat added to the warmth provided by the peki. The cost of heating such an event was enormous, but to those commanding state resources, cost was irrelevant. The governor's budget for firewood alone exceeded the total income of most frontier settlements. The governor's personal quarters included a study where he worked on administrative papers, a room kept particularly warm because ink could freeze in cold conditions. Writing with stiff fingers was difficult. This room's pack was fed continuously throughout the day, ensuring the temperature never dropped or work became uncomfortable. Maps on the walls showed the vast territory, under his nominal control, thousands of square miles of taiga and tundra, settlements scattered like seeds across impossible distances, populations existing on the edge of survival. The warmth at his study made this cold empire seem abstract, distant, manageable. Meals served in elite households were themselves markers of privilege. While frontier settlers rationed grain and survived on gruel and black bread, merchants and officials enjoyed meat and fish, preserved fruits and vegetables purchased from agricultural regions, delicacies imported at great expense. Kitchens preparing such food were warm spaces where cooking stoned, burned all-day places where servants worked in relative comfort compared to the brutal conditions of outdoor labor. Fraught food was a luxury frontier families rarely enjoyed in winter. Cooking required fuel, and fuel was too precious to use for anything beyond the bare minimum necessary for survival. Meals were oft unlukewarm at best, eaten quickly before they cooled further. But in wealthy households, food arrived at the table hot, sometimes kept warm in serving dishes designed for the purpose, eaten leisurely as conversation flowed and peck radiated steady heat. Seed drinking, particularly important in Russian culture, became an elaborate ritual in wealthy households. The samovar, literally self-minus boiler, was a device that used a small amount of fuel to keep water hot for hours, allowing tea to be prepared throughout the day without repeatedly boiling water from cold. The samovar occupied a place of honor in the dining room or parlor, its brass or copper surface polished to a shine, steam gently rising from its spout, a constant symbol of comfort and hospitality. Frontier settlers had heard of samovars, but few had ever seen one. The devices were too expensive, too delicate for rough conditions, their fuel consumption too extravagant. On the frontier, water was boiled when absolutely necessary, in simple pots hung over the fire, and drunk quickly before it cooled. The samovar implied a leisure, the ability to have hot water available at any time. The time to sit and sip tea in the afternoon, as foreign to frontier life as the idea of heated ballrooms. But privilege had its own anxieties. The elite in Siberian towns were acutely aware of how dependent they were on systems that could fail. Supply chains bringing food and goods into Siberia were long and fragile. Harsh winters could block roads and freeze rivers, cutting off towns from resupply. If we'd cast out and nearby forests were depleted and would had to be brought from greater distances, firewood prices could spike unexpectedly. Some years, even in wealthy households, the cold was felt when fuel supplies ran low or when pack malfunction and skilled repair craftsmen were unavailable. Comfort could evaporate quickly. Suddenly, the distance between merchant and settler narrowed. Both depended on fire. Both were vulnerable to cold. Both faced the possibility that warmth could fail. The officials sent from European Russia to serve in Siberian posts often found the cold shocking despite their privileged positions. They arrived expecting hardship, but not understanding what a hardship actually meant at these temperatures. Their houses would be heated as well as possible, their stoves maintained by servants, their firewood supplied by the state, and still they suffered. The cold penetrated in ways they had not anticipated, seeping through seemingly solid walls, creating drafts no ceiling could eliminate, imposing itself on their bodies and minds despite all efforts to keep it at bay. Many such officials requested transfers back to European Russia as soon as their obligated service period ended. Some could not wait that long, resigning despite damage to their careers, fleeing the Siberian cold as if pursued by a physical enemy. In their reports and letters, they wrote of the cold with genuine fear, describing it as an oppressive force, a presence that dominated life even for those with every advantage of wealth and status. The Orthodox Church offered another kind of privileged warmth. Churches in Siberian towns were substantial buildings carefully constructed, their architecture announcing the presence of faith and civilization in the wilderness. Inside these churches, services were conducted through the winter, the buildings heated though not always comfortably by massive stoves requiring constant attention. Priests and deacons lived relatively comfortably compared to their parishioners, occupying warmer, better-built dwellings. This comfort was theologically justified. Clergy needed health and focus to fulfill their spiritual duties, but it created an obvious inequality parishioners could not miss. A frontier settler struggling desperately to keep his family alive through winter could see the priest's house with its glass windows, smoke rising from a proper chimney. Such observations produced complicated feelings, respect for church authority mixed with resentment. Monasteries existing in some Siberian regions were even more privileged. Monastic communities had access to donated labor, resources provided by wealthy patrons, organizational structures allowing efficient wood collection and storage. Monks lived in cells that were small but adequately heated. Common spaces, reef quarries, chapels, workshops kept warm enough for their intended purposes. But monastic life also imposed its own hardships. Asceticism was valued. Excessive comfort was spiritually suspect. Some monasteries deliberately kept cells cold as a form of spiritual discipline, cold as a reminder of mortality and a tool for focusing the mind on eternal rather than temporal concerns. Others found a middle way, providing enough warmth for health while avoiding luxury. Military garrisons scattered across Siberia represented another kind of privileged warmth, though the privilege was relative and often minimal. Soldiers lived in barracks, buildings heated communally, large rooms with central stoves where dozens slept in close quarters. Warmth was provided by the state. Wood came from military stores. Fires were maintained according to regulations that specified how much fuel could be used each day. Conditions in these barracks were better than in frontier dwellings, but worse than in merchants' houses. Warmth was adequate, but not comfortable. Overcrowding meant disease spread rapidly when it entered a garrison. Sick soldiers often died not from the illness itself, but from the impossibility of recovering in cold, crowded, unsanitary conditions. Officers fared better, occupying separate quarters with better heating and more space. The hierarchy of rank translated directly into a hierarchy of warmth. The commander's quarters, the warmest building in the garrison, heated as well as any merchant's house, while common soldiers crowded together in barracks that provided just enough for survival. Indigenous peoples partially incorporated into the Russian administrative structure occupied ambiguous positions in this warmth hierarchy. Some had been settled in permanent villages, their traditional nomadic lifestyles discouraged or forbidden, their heating practices altered to conform to Russian expectations. Settled indigenous peoples built log structures similar to Russian dwellings and used Russian-style stoves, though they often modified these structures according to their own knowledge and preferences, maintained more traditional lifestyles, continuing to move with reindeer herds or to fish and hunt according to seasonal patterns. Their heating methods remained largely unchanged, though they increasingly incorporated Russian tools, metal axes and knives that made woodworking easier, metal pots that could be placed directly on fire, fabrics that could be used alongside traditional hides for clothing and shelter coverings. The relationship between indigenous heating knowledge and Russian heating practice was complex, not entirely one-way. Some Russian settlers learned valuable techniques from indigenous neighbors' methods for traveling safely in extreme cold, for quickly building shelters from available materials, knowledge about which plants could be used for insulation or fire starting to the overall flow of cultural influence was toward Russification. Traditional indigenous knowledge often disparaged or dismissed, even as it was quietly adopted in modified forms. Then there were the exiles, political prisoners, criminals, others sent to Siberia as punishment. These people existed in a shadow world between the desperate poverty of the frontier settler and the relative security of permanent residence. Some exiles were educated, literate people who had offended authorities, who found themselves in dwellings rougher than anything they had previously experienced, struggling with heating methods they had never needed to understand before. Memoirs of educated exiles provide some of the most detailed descriptions of Siberian heating practices because these writers had the literacy and motivation to record their experiences. They wrote of the shock of living in Smoky's Nki, of learning to manage fire for the first time, of a persistent cold that seemed no amount of fire could fully defeat. Their writings reveal how profoundly warmth was a privilege in their former lives, so complete that they had not even recognized it as privilege until it was taken away. Some exiles adapted, learned the skills needed to survive, became in time almost indistinguishable from other frontier settlers. Others did not adapt, died of cold, of diseases exacerbated by cold, of despair. The exile system was brutal in many ways, but perhaps its most brutal aspect was how completely it stripped away comfort, reducing existence to where survival itself became the only possible achievement. Traders traveling between settlements and towns experienced the full range of Siberian warmth. They might spend one night in a comfortable inn in Tobolsk, sleeping in a bed beside a well-maintained pec, the next night in a rough post station with barely adequate heating, the next night in the open, camping beside a fire that kept the cold at bay but never defeated it. These travelers developed a kind of adaptability, an ability to find what warmth was available and make do, that they also developed a profound appreciation for good heating when they encountered it. Hence, existing in larger towns were themselves interesting studies in heating economics. The best inns had rooms with individual pecai, allowing guests to control their own warmth. The cheaper inns had communal heating, a large stove and a shared space where multiple guests gathered. The cheapest lodgings offered little more than a roof and walls. Travelers expected to provide their own warmth through clothing and blankets. The price of a room corresponded directly to the quality of heating provided, because in winter, warmth was the primary commodity a traffic needed. Seasonal rhythms in Siberian towns created a cadence where summer was preparation time for winter heating needs. In the brief warm months, wood was cut and stacked, stoves were inspected and repaired, chimneys were cleaned, keils were replaced when damaged. Wealthy families employed craftsmen to perform these tasks professionally, ensuring their heating systems would function when cold returned. Poorer families did what they could with their own labor and limited resources, knowing any failure in preparation could be fatal when winter arrived. There were also the servants and their own problems of warmth. In wealthy households, servants lived in quarters, usually the coldest parts of the house, rooms near exterior walls, spaces without pec-eye, areas where heat from the main stoves barely reached. Servants rose early to light fires for their masters, worked in cold conditions so that warmth would be established by the time the family awoke. The servant tending the stove might be warm while performing that duty standing by the fire, handling hot wood, but their other hours were spent in cold spaces, their sleeping quarters often merely warmer than outdoors. This warmth hierarchy within households reflected the larger social hierarchy. Warmth flowed to power, to wealth, to status. Goals at the bottom of the social structure: servants, laborers, frontier settlers, indigenous peoples increasingly marginalized on their own lands experienced cold more directly, more constantly, with fewer buffers between their bodies and the winter environment. Those at the top experienced cold as an abstract threat, something existing outside their well-heated spaces, managed by others on their behalf. Yet even the elite could not completely escape the cold. The Siberian winter imposed itself on everyone, regardless of privilege. The officials might work in heated offices, but they still had to travel between buildings, still had to venture outside for various necessities, still experienced the sting of wind in the way extreme cold penetrated even the best fur coats and felt boots. And always there was knowledge, sometimes explicit, sometimes buried, but never completely absent, that this comfort was contingent. The fire in the woodshed could destroy a season's fuel supply. The harsh winter could disrupt supply chains, making firewood scarce, even for those who could normally afford it. An accident or illness could reduce a family's circumstances, turning comfort into struggle within a season or two. The distance between the governor's warm ballroom and the frontier settlers' smokies Enlia Nka was measured not only in liles and rubles, but in layers of wealth and health, in the fragile stability of systems keeping civilization functioning in an environment hostile to human life. The architecture of Siberian towns reflected this warmth hierarchy. The finest buildings, government offices, merchants' houses, churches were built with double walls, with insulation in the form of packed earth or sawdust, with carefully designed roofs that shed snow while retaining heat. These buildings stood as monuments to the possibility of comfort in impossible conditions, announcing that human ingenuity could create warm spaces in some of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. That surrounding these fine buildings were structures of lesser quality, houses that were adequate but not comfortable, workshops heated barely enough, were houses not heated at all. And beyond the towns, extending to every horizon, were the forests and plains where frontier settlers lived, under conditions townspeople preferred not to examine too closely, where the struggle for warmth was immediate, constant, never truly won. On the coldest nights, when temperatures dropped to extremes that would kill unprotected flesh in minutes, even the elite's warm rooms seemed like fragile bubbles of warmth in the sea of cold. The pec-eye burned brightly, candles flickered, conversation and music filled the air, but outside the windows, the cold pressed close, patient and inexorable, waiting for any failure of fire, fuel, or vigilance. The elite could mostly ignore that cold, could pretend that comfort was permanent and secure. But in the deep of winter nights, when the wind howled and temperatures plummeted, even the most privileged sometimes woke and wondered whether their warmth would hold, whether the systems they depended on would continue to function, whether the distance between their comfort and the frontier settlers' desperation was really as great as it seemed by day. Fire burned in the governor's study, the merchant's bedroom, the priest's dwelling, the soldier's barracks, the exile's rough shelter, the frontier settlers' Emlia Nka. The same fire, the same wood, the same basic chemistry of combustion turning fuel into heat. But the experience of that warmth differed so profoundly between social positions, it was almost as if they were entirely different phenomena. Comfort in one context, survival in another. The distance between them measured in money and power, and in the accident of birth determining who would live in warmth and who would struggle with cold forever. Because in Ember's historical resonance and modern warmth, only have reached the end of her journey through the cold, through the Smokies Emlia Nkea where settlers scraped for embers in the dark, through the patient life of Ivan Petrovich into stones, the health heat-like memory through the puzzles buried in permafrost, through the privileged worm wounds,